Hello and welcome back to the Brew Hoop podcast. After a 1 week sojourn into the depths of South Carolina for a baby shower last week, Adam Paris, co-managing editor, that's me, of course, is back for this episode. And kudos to Riley and Kyle for just stepping up big time last week and hosting a beautiful, beautiful pod. And this week, while we're not joined by Kyle, Riley Feldman, my compatriot, is here as well. Riley, how are you doing on this Sunday after a tragic Bucks loss to the Sixers?
Wait, hold on. It was a baby shower? I thought you were going for like a special on-the-ground report of Chris Middleton's background and what it means for the upcoming contract that he's going to get.
I'm not going to say I didn't try and scout out the trees and the backyard that he was shooting through to sort of see if maybe he was seeing those in his eyes and during the Sixers game or something. But yeah, no, it was clear skies at this baby shower. In the diaper race, I performed really poorly. I realized I put the diaper on backwards and I didn't give the baby any leg room. So I just strapped the legs into the diaper, which I found out was wrong.
This got a lot weirder, a lot quicker than I thought it would. So it's probably best if we move on from the shower and start talking some basketball.
Yeah, that's actually a really smart move. So sorry about that for any listeners. So first off, Kyle thankfully got to go to the game. Sadly, it wasn't a win, but we just want to give a quick update that he gave us in our notes.
His special report.
His special
on the ground report.
This was his in arena report. Went through rigorous editing. All right. Quote, garbage birthday present. Bucks couldn't hit a shot. Sixers made tough baskets. Wilson back is good.
Now, by Wilson back, does it mean like Wilson's back is good, or like Wilson I'm assuming Wilson being back is what he's going for, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably what Kyle wanted to say. So, so hopefully that doesn't get taken any further than it should. Like last week when I was accused of being a Sixers sympathizer, thankfully Kyle jumped to my defense. Just because I live in Philadelphia does not mean I am a Sixers sympathizer. So this win will smart a little bit because I'll have to hear some crap from my roommates. But I just wanted to go on the record here against what Riley said and let people know I'm not a Sixers sympathizer. This win, it smarted more than I thought. Riley, I don't know if I think it's the Bucks. Just one, we haven't lost that much this year, so it's every win hurts a little more, every loss hurts a little more. But two, just as we get closer to playoff time, it's just, and we play an opponent like this, it's just hard not to get kind of ramped up, especially on a Sunday nationally televised game, right?
Yeah, it was like the confluation of like all the awful things that could go into a Sunday matinee game. So you got the national TV audience, which I'm sure doesn't really matter to the players, but it adds a little bit of extra pressure to at least to the fans at home. And then you have a potential playoff matchup, like a team that I personally despise with all my, being. I'm not sure if that's the same for the players, but obviously they're a challenger for the playoffs. And like you said, as you kind of get closer to the playoffs, everything kind of goes underneath the microscope. Like it's one thing if you're blowing teams out in the first third of the season, like, oh, wow, this is crazy. But as you get closer to the end, you kind of lapse into thinking where it's like, okay, do you finish strong or are you kind of sputtering nearish the end in comparison to the rest of the season? So to come in a little shorthanded with the Brogdon issue, and we'll get into that later, but to come in, struggle throughout the evening, kind of keep it close to the end, but still not be able to get it over the top. Yeah, it's frustrating whether or not it means a lot for the rest of the season. We'll kind of get into that.
Yeah, and of course the Bucks lose 130 to 125 on their home court. Fiserv Forum looked like it was ready to explode a couple of times, but the Bucks just couldn't get over that hump. We have to, of course, shout out Giannis for his new career high. He eclipsed the 50-point mark, so ended with 52 points, 16 rebounds, and 7 assists. Joel Embiid for the Sixers really beasted as well, 40 points, 15 rebounds, just 4 of 13 from 3, so he was a willing shooter, but hit it right around his season average. That's about what he's shooting. But he really was a mammoth down there for Philadelphia late. And Jimmy Butler went off for 27 points. Some really, really difficult shots made by him. If you look at just some of the base stats here, so basically points in the paint were even. That's always never a really good indication. The Bucks always do really well in the paint, so we're even at 46. Bucks really eclipsed them in fast break points, 32 to 13. If you're looking at the raw shooting numbers, Philadelphia shoots 47%, Bucks at 45.3. But the standout number, of course, is the 3-point shooting. So the Bucks attempt 50 attempts today, 16 for 50 on the day, 32%. Meanwhile, the 76ers shoot 32 attempts, yet make just one less than the Bucks at 15. So they're at 46.9%. And the other thing that really stands out to me, Riley, was the Bucks' really poor defensive rebounding rate. 70%. This is on the ESPN.com box score. Looking at there, that would be the Bucks' fourth worst mark of the season. And as most of you know, the Bucks have just vaulted up the standings this year in terms of defensive rebounding to the top of the league. And if you look at some of the stats on cleaning the glass, so on putbacks, Philadelphia basically had how many, they have the stat points per miss on putbacks. So it's how many putback points did the team score per 100 missed field goals or reboundable free throws. So the Sixers are up at 31.6 on that, which was ranked in the 87th percentile in the league. And if you look at how much the Bucks normally allow, it's 15.5. So basically half of that, which is the second best mark in the league. And even the worst team in the league in that category, Phoenix Suns, allowed 23.7. So the Philadelphia 76ers second chance points and offensive rebounds really hurt the Bucks today.
Yeah, and I wonder how much of that is just like the nature of their roster, because everybody talks about it, but they have like an especially long and tall team. And when you have Embiid out there, who is obviously just a load to handle by himself, physical wise, and then you have Simmons, Butler, Harris as of late, JJ Redick to a lesser extent, and then you have Boban off the bench. They just have a lot of dudes who, I don't know if it's too much of a load to handle. I know there was a lot of possessions or a lot of minutes where like DJ was stuck out there, and it's like he's doing everything he can to wall Embiid off, but there's only so much that the physical difference between the two he can kind of try and overcome through sheer effort or kind of creativity. And I think it ended up working out at least a little bit when Lopez was out there, because Giannis was able to scoop up 15 defensive rebounds. So in theory, that still kind of worked out where Lopez still walls off the main rebounder on the other team and just kind of lets Giannis get it and initiate the offense from there. But even then, there was a lot of times where a rebound would kind of cling off and a lot of guys were kind of scrambling. It wasn't very clearly going to one Bucks player or another. It was just a lot of like scrambling on the baseline to try and get the rebound. And I mean, 15 offensive rebounds to the Sixers, it's not great to Milwaukee's 10, but I think it might just be that the Sixers are uniquely kind of prepared for it. And it's super annoying, obviously, but I'm not sure how much you have to worry about that being something that goes on kind of down the stretch. And maybe depending on, I don't know, there's not really anybody that can back up to go against Embiid besides Lopez. We don't really, I'm not going to toss Pau Gasol out there for sure. I mean, you want to see your rebounding numbers tank, that's how you do it. But I think there's probably something to kind of keep an eye on, and then maybe Bud will have a different approach. The teams meet once more again this season, I think in Philadelphia. So we'll get another chance at it, but they just have a uniquely constructed roster that makes it a pain to deal with.
Yeah, and I think that, well, the interesting thing about the idea of their uniquely fitting rosters, I remember after the Tobias Harris trade was made or whatever, it sort of floated on Twitter. I wonder if there's a rationale for the Bucks to try and supersize and go with that, like Giannis, Ersan, Lopez lineup to try and counteract all the length that the Sixers had. Frank Madden adroitly pointed out that he thought that maybe just going with Brogdon would be sticking with the regular lineup might be a better solution anyway. But, you saw obviously that Brogdon won't be a solution for a little while here. And like you said, we'll get into that later. But I mean, it seemed like the Bucks with Mirotic in there, it's not a fantastic defensive rebounder, but it seems like they should have had enough length to counteract any advantages that the Sixers had. I think you're right that Embiid's weight and power down low really can just counteract what the Bucks are able to do. And I mean, even the fact that he shoots 13 3-pointers, part of that is that probably draws Lopez out to the perimeter a little bit too. So you can't quite, you can't quite use some of his amazing box out skills that have really helped the Bucks defensive rebounding numbers. So then you get guys like Ben Simmons or Jimmy Butler or freaking Mike Scott, crashing the glass
and falling into the stands and taking a drink out of somebody's cup.
Yeah. I mean, respect to that guy for having the wherewithal to look to his right, see the cup, take it out and drink it. I mean, that was spectacular. And who it looked just like Coke, which is too bad. I wish it was like a beer or something and he had chugged the whole thing. But, the other thing that was interesting when I was thinking about the offensive rebounding numbers, and you mentioned it too, it did just seem like there were a lot of loose balls that just went their way, and it really seemed like Budenholzer was kind of doing he was certainly just doing the coach speak thing and all of his
we need effort. We need more effort out there.
Yeah,
guys.
we need more effort. They're getting all the loose balls. Even like the one in the huddle segment that they did on ESPN was he was just like, they're getting to every single loose ball. We need to get these. But I think there's something to that. I mean, they use those kind of things all the time, but I mean, it did seem like some of those were just clanking off, going slightly longer. I mean, there's one where DJ Wilson had I think it was Embiid, like fronted, then flipped around, had really good box out position, and it just like went a little bit over his head. So sometimes that's just how the ball bounces, and there's nothing you can do in that respect.
Yeah, and it doesn't help when there was, in that regard, you could say the rebounding was definitely probably an advantage for Philadelphia, but there was a lot of opportunities obviously on the other end for the Bucks to take advantage. And I guess we can kind of start talking about that a little bit. Like the biggest thing, or what I think a lot of people are probably going to point to, I haven't looked at like the comments in the post game, but there was a stretch, I think in the second quarter, maybe into the third, where Chris, in place of Brogdon, since he's out, kind of led the substitute unit. And there was time after time where he was getting switched on to Boban, and he just wasn't able to take advantage. And that kind of bled into a larger issue with the game where the Bucks got a ton of good looks from three. They got all the different types of looks that they're usually looking for, either at the rim or from three. And for one reason or another, they just weren't able to get it to go. I think Mirotic ended up 1 for 7 for the night. And I don't think he made a single three, but almost every single, I think every single one of his attempts was wide open. And there was countless times where Giannis did his usual thing where he drive and kick, and sometimes the guy would get it to go in. DJ, I think he found him on a couple of drives, and that converted 3-pointers. But in general, for some odd reason, and again, this is an issue with when you're just so reliant on the jump shooting, is that when the jump shots don't go down, then you're going to have a tough time, and that's reflected in the sheer number of threes that Milwaukee made. And it wasn't like 50 totally contested threes. It was a lot better of a look than that base number would show you. So I think that's a concern, but I'm not sure if that's just kind of inherent in the way that they play, or if it's something we should be demanding more of, or how you would look at that.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about this one is it felt like a game of outliers, perhaps on both ends. So I mean, you're not going to expect Philadelphia to shoot 46.9% from three almost ever. If you look at cleaning the glass on 3-pointers, they're ranked 7th in the league at 36.5%. So you're not really going to expect them to be able to do that. The Bucks, of course, shoot 35.7%. So there's not a huge amount of difference between those two teams, but Bucks obviously 32% today, so it's a little bit of an outlier game for the Bucks, especially considering how many good shots that they had. We talked already about the defensive rebounding numbers for the Bucks. That was certainly an outlier, and I don't really think maybe we'll see if they meet in the playoffs whether this was symptomatic of what this new Sixers lineup can do against the Bucks. But to me, it seemed a little bit more about Bucks maybe just not taking care of their business, or a bit of bouncing of the ball today. And then you also look at it really seemed like the Sixers were hitting some incredibly difficult shots, especially from mid-range. On the day, per cleaning the glass, they shoot 47.8% from the mid-range. That's on 46 attempts too, right? It's a really high number from the mid-range. Of course, the Bucks give those up all the time, but on the season, they're shooting 39.9%, just about middle of the pack. So it's a little bit of an outlier game for them. And shooting, if a team shot 47.8% from the mid-range over the course of a season, I mean, that would be incredible. I mean, even Golden State, who's the top mid-ranging shooting team in the league, 45.6%. So it seemed like there was a lot of stuff that maybe went well for the Sixers today, especially in terms of shooting, their rebounding. It seemed like all their stuff, anything that they really could have wanted, basically went probably according to game plan, besides the fact that they couldn't stop Giannis on the day.
Yeah, I think this is another game where you point at and just say, continue to, this is ironic because it's the Sixers, but you quote unquote trust the process that that Bud has put in place, especially on the defensive end, because I think people kind of mentally replay the game, and those Embiid threes kind of near the end of the game will jump out, or at least the wide open attempts that he gets, just because of the drop scheme and the fact that Brook Lopez kind of sits in space and kind of shades with whoever the pick and roll guy is, just kind of prevents there being anything other than a mid-ranger. And because he gets sucked in so deep, he's not able to close out all that effectively. But normally you're not going to run into guys like Embiid who are willing or able to make those kinds of 3-point shots. And even then, 4 or 13, I mean, I don't know. For me, I'd rather Embiid be taking those shots than trying to kind of beast it down low. So I would caution people from overreacting to the fact that Brook Lopez isn't exactly deft enough to be able to cover all that ground, because the scheme is set up to be able to cover for that. So yes, it's annoying, and maybe there'll be slight adjustments, but don't let the fact that Embiid made like a 3 at the end and then taunted fans to kind of jump out and, kind of drive you to want to change the entire system, because it's worked so far. Yes, it's a pain, but again, this is a big outlier, and you just hope it corrects itself as the season goes along.
Yeah, and the thing that I always was really interested by the fact we all know that the Bucks shoot threes and shots at the rim, and we'll touch on this again later. But I think the absence of Brogdon will really affect their amount of attempts at the rim. And I mean, you saw he's gone today. They shoot 53 pointers. It's an incredibly high number. But I wanted Bledsoe to drive at the rim a lot more when Boban was in the game, and I really think that that's something that he's really going to have to pick up in Brogdon's absence. Is it seems like Bledsoe is just so fast, and that's where he's really effective, is driving to the rim, getting past his guys. And I don't think Philadelphia has a guy who can really match him, especially with Butler probably having to guard Middleton. I think that Bledsoe on Redick matchup is their biggest advantage, because Redick just doesn't have the speed to keep up with him.
Yep.
And like you said, the Sixers went really big, and there's advantages to that, but the Bucks have the advantage at the guard spot. And the Sixers, people talked a lot about how they don't really have a guy who can match up against elite point guards in the East. So I think that's where we really missed the fact that Bledsoe had a tough day in the office, 5 for 14, just 12 points, 2 steals, 6 assists. So I think he's someone who you really should watch if these teams match up again, and definitely in that April 4th matchup. I think it is when they square off again.
When did the Sixers trade for Terry Rozier? Am I right? But no, I agree that of all the different positions, just because they play with Ben Simmons, and I mean, Simmons is an all right defender, but Eric Bledsoe still has the speed and athleticism. And he got to the rim or close to the rim, or at least forced the defense to collapse a couple of times, and that kind of led to open shots elsewhere as well. But I agree that if we're going to be out with Brogdon, and again, we don't know what the full timeline is, but kind of seeing, is he able to pick up the offensive load? And it's not going to be picking up the offensive load, adding more 3-pointers, because we're already shooting a lot of 3-pointers. So Chris has kind of struggled a little bit. I don't know if it's just because his dribble isn't nearly as tight, or if again, maybe this is me just looking at anecdotal evidence or what I can kind of remember, but I'm not sure the last time that Chris had an easy time driving towards the rim. So if the only other options are like post Brook up or Giannis cutting to the rim, that's going to get old real quick. And part of the plus of having Brogdon is that you can still attack the paint without having to rely on just Giannis beasting it and getting kind of beat up all night long. So I agree that if Bledsoe's gonna, prove his worth, it would be wonderful if he stepped up and increased his attacking inside. And he's still got the speed and athleticism, I guess, especially against a team like the Sixers, to take advantage of that.
Yeah, he finished a team worst -70 today. So say what you want about.
No big deal.
Yep, yeah, no big deal. Nothing to see here. What was I'm trying to think of something else that was interesting. Okay, did you hear this? Is this true? Was this a story that already came out, that Ersan broke his nose so many times that his facial ID stopped working on his phone?
I did hear that. I'm not. I heard. Was it Mike Breen on the call? Who was on the call?
I think so. It was. Yeah, I don't remember. I'm sorry.
Or no. I can't remember.
It was the other guy.
Kirby and shout out other guy. No, I did. I hadn't heard that story before he revealed it to the world.
That was incredible. So shout out to you, Ersan, for taking another charge on Jimmy Butler. That was beautiful. Also shout out Chris Middleton for continuing his revenge tour on Jimmy Butler and slamming that shot in his face, slamming that dunk. That was absolutely picturesque.
Doesn't make up for the fact that he was 6 for 16 before those final threes in the fourth quarter, bro.
It's totally true. Totally true. All right. Well, let's start to talk about, this was obviously, the Sixers game was a really big game. Too bad that the Bucks lost, but I think we talked enough about that. So let's move on to talking a little bit more about the week that was. So let's start at the beginning of the week. Of course, this was the fateful game against the San Antonio Spurs. A bat came out. Bucks lose that one. Really, it seemed like it basically seemed to go according to script. Bucks are a little shorthanded, I think, and the Spurs just medieval mid-range game lays siege to the Bucks, 32-6 in mid-range points. It's kind of what we expected going into that game, right, Riley? They just executed their offense. Bucks give up mid-range shots, and they hit the shots.
Lots of Pau Gasol minutes, a lot of Pau Gasol minutes. No, it wasn't just that the Spurs did exactly what you expect them to do and did it to perfection, but it was also like the most schedule loss of all schedule losses because the Bucks had played the Hornets the night before. I think the game finished at it was a late start too, so it was like an 8 o'clock start. So the game didn't end till 10:30. They must have flown immediately after getting hit in the showers in the locker room to San Antonio. Then you had daylight savings time, so you lose an hour of sleep. And then I can't remember. I'm sure the Spurs are pretty good at home, but you have all that, a little bit injury trouble, and you got a lot of Pau Gasol minutes, and you're going to end up with loss. The most frustrating part was like how late the starters were out there, just because if you're going to lose, you'd rather them get a little bit of rest. But it was still close all the way through the fourth, so I'm not going to criticize that all that much.
Yeah, those backs-to-backs are killer. I mean, the fact that they've lost they had to go on a back-to-back to Utah, and then they got to go on a back-to-back to San Antonio. I mean, those are just going to be tough places to win, even if it's not on a back-to-back. So that one wasn't too surprising to me. And then they get back on track with a win against New Orleans last Tuesday, 130-113. They came out a little slow out of the gates, but that's just one where you kind of just have to trust in the fact that the Bucks were going to get it together. And Giannis goes for 24 points, and they picked it up by the end of the game, and were able to really take control of it, especially in the second quarter. And then they score a 45-point third quarter, and they really they take care of business against the Pelicans.
Yeah, you survived the storm of Anthony Davis. He's on a artificially lowered minutes limit just because it's a weird New Orleans right now. So you survive his 20 minutes. He did really well in those 20 minutes, but then otherwise it's like, okay, force Julius Randle to beat us, and he was unable to. And they had a lot of Frank Jackson 3-point attempts, which is probably not a recipe for success. So you weather the initial storm, and eventually you just kind of beat them via sheer talent. So nothing too remarkable there, I don't think.
Yeah, once again, I'll fully admit I think I'm a decent basketball fan, but when I saw the Frank Jackson in their starting lineup, I did a double take. I had no idea who he was.
Didn't you say there was two people who was
I didn't know Kenrick Williams. Yeah, I didn't know Kenrick Williams either. And Frank Jackson, credit to that guy, man, hoists up 18 shots in that game, goes 7 for 18. He doesn't even care. Takes more shots than Anthony Davis.
I'm going to be honest. We had to be really afraid of Jason Smith, the Jason Smith revenge game. I think he ended with 3 rebounds, and he took 3 threes. He made none of them, and he took 4 field goals overall and made none of them in 6 minutes. So the Bucks were able to they ducked the Jason Smith revenge game at least.
Yeah, that was some excellent double agent work there by Jason Smith. So then the week ends with a night in Miami after, I don't know if I'm sure they didn't go home. I'm sure they just went to Miami and spent a couple nights there.
Yep.
Bucks, of course, go in, just play like garbage, play like they have in Miami for sometimes these past couple years, and they end up down 20 at halftime. And then completely flip the script in the second half and end up winning 113-98. And it's not even particularly close down the stretch. Giannis leads with 33 points, 16 rebounds, and 9 assists. Just an absolute mammoth effort from him. And I noticed they said on the broadcast, too, that was, I believe they said that's the most points Giannis has ever scored in Miami or against Miami. But I wasn't any smart Bucks fan know that Giannis has had some trouble against the Heat. So I wasn't too surprised by that stat. But still good to see him kind of break out of what's been an annoying trend of him struggling against the Heat and finishing plus 19 too. So just a big night for him and a huge night for the Bucks to come back and take care of business in South Beach.
Yeah, I wasn't able to watch much of the game just because I was under the weather and was asleep at like 8 o'clock. So I only caught the first 45 minutes or so. But I think it's nice to kind of have that boogeyman off your back. Not that the Bucks really view the Heat as being a team that's really worth worrying about. I saw that James Johnson did not play, and for one reason or another, James Johnson is among the 4 guys who are quote unquote Giannis stoppers in the league, which is really odd. But he just happens to give him a hard time. I think the Heat would be a gigantic pain in the butt if we had to play him in the first round, just because they could batter the hell out of Giannis for 4 or 5 games, however long it took. And you want to avoid any chance for injuries or kind of draining the stamina right away. But I think it was just a matter of giving a damn in the second half, and that's what happened, and the Bucks win. So you can hold, if you hold an NBA team to 2 consecutive 18-point quarters in terms of scoring, you're doing something right. So good on the Bucks to at least show, as we all know, that they have a capability of kind of surmounting no matter what kind of lead, especially against mediocre competition.
Yeah, I think it said they were the first team in the shot clock era to be trailed by 20 at halftime and still win by 15 at the end of the game.
Crazy.
So, yeah, I know there's a random stat to just pluck out of midair, but yeah, it was crazy when they just the Heat just started packing it in, and the Bucks just overpowered them and overwhelmed them. So that was an impressive effort by them. One of the through lines from this past week, though, Riley, has kind of been Pat Connaughton emerging from the bench, and I don't really think he's doing much differently besides the only change that seems to have been is that he's been hitting his 3-point shot with a little more consistency. So if you look starting with that San Antonio game, he went 4 for 4 in that game against the Pelicans, 1 for 3, but then was a big 3 for 6 against Miami. And then if you look at this Philadelphia game, I'm just pulling it up here, 2 for 4. So not a bad day for him. He finished -6, but obviously, with the loss of Brogdon, you need these guys on the bench to be able to hit shots consistently. This was something I was kind of nervous about coming into the season, just because he he shot 30, or his 3-point percentage. He shot 35.2% in Portland last year, but that was really the only time he's actually had a decent volume even in the NBA yet. So he had 200 attempts last year, 35.2% percentage from deep. The 2 years before that, he'd only attempted 54 shots total from 3-point land. So this year he's 45 for 147, down to 30.6%. So, it's hard to really read a whole lot into that trend. He could just be having a hot streak like most shooters do, but I guess we'll kind of find out here down the stretch whether that 35.2% was more his ceiling on his percentage from deep, or if that was more of just an outlier.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's been any guy. I mean, you could say Chris Middleton just because he's more divisive, but a guy who's had such a high and low just throughout the season. Like Pat Connaughton started off the season seemingly really well just because he was getting a lot of minutes and he was like dunking, and I had no idea he could dunk. Hashtag no prejudice. And then like midway through the season, he kind of dropped off. And just as he looked through I think games 20 through like 60 or 20 through 60, I think he was just shooting like less than 30% from 3. And now he's back. And I think maybe, not that I wish injury on any of the guys, obviously, because you'd rather have full complement, but one of the few bright sides, I guess, with having to force Connaughton out there is if he's a guy who needs a lot of like just high volume and just needs more time to get into a rhythm. The fact that Dante is unavailable and George Hill was unavailable and Sterling has been unavailable, maybe that's all to the plus because you can kind of ride Connaughton here as he's hot and just see if that continues on for a couple of weeks. But definitely fortuitous timing on his part. I'm not sure if you can expect it to last and rely upon it into the playoffs just because we've already seen that he can have a tough stretch, but good for him for stemming up and not having us focus on the fact that he was getting caught out on defense time after time for, on that West Coast road trip, which was a little brutal for him.
Yeah. Credit to that guy for, he does a decent job affecting the game in plenty of different ways with some of his energy plays and that kind of stuff. Both him and Dante do that, but obviously both of those guys really need shots to go in for them to have the type of value that the Bucks need and Bud needs for them to play him on the court. So good on him. And that's something to track as we get down into the final stretch of the season here. So, all right, Riley. Well, I think we just need to start to transition into talking about the big news, of course, that Malcolm Brogdon is going to be out for 6 to 8 weeks. But before we do that, I want to make a quick break for an ad. And on the other side of this, I am going to tell you about why my Bucks optimism and fandom has reached a renewed level of fervor. So stay tuned for that after the break.
Damn, that was a sick radio, like sports radio, like coming up next. I'm going to tell you why. Malcolm Brogdon is the key to my fandom. After the break.
Oh, it actually has nothing to do with Brogdon, but it does make me a little scared for my fandom. So,
okay.
All right. All right. And we're back. And Riley, I live my life, boo. Oh, Jesus! I'm so nervous to say this on air. I'm just like,
okay.
I'm so.
This is a
Oh my
safe.
God.
This is a safe environment. Everybody welcomes you, Adam. Just let it get it off your chest. Come on, man.
Okay. I live my life by a lot of different tenets, but two of my core ones that I think that have really gotten me to a good place in life are sort of my financial frugality and a level of honesty that I think you would agree are really important in both life itself, but also especially relationships, right?
Yes, I would agree. I'm curious where this goes, but yes, I agree.
So I made a decision this week that flew basically in the face of both of those, and I'm hoping it doesn't have any repercussions for my impending marriage this fall. So I know for a fact my fiance does not listen to this podcast, so this will be a running theme going throughout the rest of the season. But I made my first sports bet ever, and
Whoa.
I bet not a significant amount of money because I still am frugal, but enough that I feel like I have a little skin in the game on the Bucks to win the NBA championship.
Whoa, what kind of odds did you get? I have no idea how to read odds or what they mean, so you might have to explain it, but were they favorable?
I think they were favorable. I got them at 10-1 odds, and a week later the Bucks were down to 9-1. So I felt like I had made a smart choice, but I also knew that I was, delving into something maybe, that maybe might have a little repercussions because a couple weeks ago, I'll say I just sort of floated this idea out there. I was feeling pretty high about the Bucks. Looked at my fiance and I said, I was thinking about maybe like placing like a small bet on the Bucks, to see how they would do. And she turned to me, and her eyes looked like the devil's, and she said, "Don't you know we have a wedding coming up? You better not place a bet."
That's a really good impression of her. That's for those that don't know, that's exactly what her voice sounds like too.
So this will be our little secret, me and all the podcast listeners. Thankfully, she's woefully absent from social media, so I feel pretty good about this, and it makes me nervous. But it's I think it should be a fun little thing to follow throughout the rest of the year.
I was waiting for that story to veer off, and she looked at me and said, "What the hell is a Milwaukee Buck?" Like, totally oblivious to anything that you do for the site or what the Bucks are at all. No, that's quite the show of confidence. I've never put down any sort of money on sports betting. One, because I don't know what the odds mean. Two, I have no idea where to do it. I would be the kind of guy that, even though it's legal in this country now, I would definitely get arrested for it. And three, I'm not nearly intelligent enough to make any sort of educated guess, either on a game-to-game or a season basis. So kudos to you for putting your money where your mouth is, even though you don't really talk all that much trash. So I guess it doesn't work that, but that's going to be a lot of pressure, and we'll be able to tell week to week. We'll just have like a how is Adam's bet doing, or we'll just kind of track the odds, kind of see how it works. I think it'll be an interesting fold for the rest of the season.
I'll just like tweet out pictures. I'll wear the same shirt each week and tweet out pictures of like how much I've pulled my collar out after each game.
Have you just like running like, okay.
So depending on if like that's completely loose and it looks like supposed to fit like a guy with like a giant head, that's how we can track it in the weeks ahead. But hopefully you'll go along with this this little game we have here, listeners, and both follow some of my financial future and my general future with my marriage coming up. So fingers crossed that goes well.
Anything for the pod. Hashtag anything for the pod.
Anything for the pod. Hope my dad keeps it quiet, though. I know he listens. All right. Okay. Listeners don't need to hear anymore. So let's talk a lot about this Malcolm Brogdon injury. We were saying right before we came on that he might be the most interesting guy to discuss just because I feel like, I'm including myself in this, kind of take him a little bit for granted. I mean, he's having a 50, 40, 90 season. You hear about that all the time. But, if we lost Eric Bledsoe, it would be like, okay, how are we going to get a point guard, some guy who can initiate offense, some guy who's going to lead the defense? What are we going to do there? Chris Middleton, just not going to go down that road. But I think that would be a difficult discussion as well for some people. Brook Lopez, I mean, like, obviously he's been such a huge part of the Bucks and what they do. And I'm not even going to say the G word, knock on some wood. So this Malcolm Brogdon injury, it's a minor plantar fascia tear. They expected him to be out 6 to 8 weeks. In the ESPN article that was penned, They said there was, quote, optimism he could return closer to 6 weeks, end quote. 6 weeks, the 6-week mark would put him at about April 26th. 8-week mark would be May 10th. So obviously he'll miss the rest of the regular season. And then if you I looked at the playoffs last year to sort of see where he might be returned, even if he came back at that 6-week mark. So game 1 of that Boston-Philly second round matchup took place on April 30th last year. So if he came back right at the earliest time, he would probably be back for the start of this Bucks hopeful second round matchup if they make it that far. A couple other just quick medical notes. If you looked at, there's a tweet from David J. Chow, MD, on Twitter, who is known for helping with football injuries when they happen and that kind of stuff. Said, quote, plantar fascia tear often is good news in that it relieves the problem of being too tight. However, it is a 4 to 6 week step back for the ultimate step forward. So David J. Chow, also poet laureate, clearly there with the interesting wording.
Can we get that guy on for a guest column here, please? Yeah. Please, doctor, if you hear us, if you're listening, right in.
Excuse me. Jeff Stotts, who runs the indispensable InStreetClothes.com, also said he had an article about this in reference to Al Jefferson's plantar fascia injury, I think back in the 2014 playoffs. Said, this is when I knew it was probably a time where Malcolm Brogdon should probably go out when he says the plantar fascia is specifically designed to withstand and disperse the increased forces associated with walking, running, and jumping. So pretty vital stuff there for basketball.
If you're going to be playing a sport, those are generally pretty important things.
If you look at sort of the range of times that people were out, it looked like it was around 14 to 26 games where people were there in his database. I'll make sure to include a link to that article in the article on Brew Hoop for the podcast. Pau Gasol actually had this exact injury. He was out for 20 games, it looked like. So, and actually I'm talking with an expert on the issue, as if Riley Feldman has also suffered some issues with plantar fasciitis, I believe, right?
Correct. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and give myself the title MD. So any doctors that are listening, I'm not jumping over that, but I do run quite a bit. And this is kind of an issue that's common among runners. I'm not sure if there's any rhyme or reason why you get it, but for those that haven't experienced before, I didn't have a tear, but I have had plantar fasciitis, and it just feels like this burning that's going on in the middle of your foot. And it becomes doubly aggravated when you're doing all those sorts of actions, like you said, even just repetitive. Like if you keep the weight off your foot while running, it's still going to kind of flare up, unfortunately. And it's just this dull aching pain that flares every once in a while. And really the only solution, if you don't have the tear, is just to stay off it and not really do anything. I'm guessing I'm not sure if it's something where you get the tear just out of the blue, or if that's just something that leads up to if you're dealing with fasciitis and then eventually it tears just from kind of having the pressure with it. I'm assuming that's probably the case in this situation. And if so, I mean, I feel for Malcolm, because that is such a pain to have to, especially playing at that high of a level night after night and dealing with that kind of pain that kind of debilitates you. Shout out to him. So I think it's probably best that he gets a little bit of rest here. It is really painful. It's really annoying, just because there's nothing you can do. There's no like stretches, or you can ice it a little bit, but otherwise just inactivity. So not fun, but at least it happened now with the chance for him to come back in the playoffs instead of, with, a week or two from now where we'd be deep into the playoffs before he could even hope to come back.
Yeah, that's totally true. And like you said, it sounds like this is probably for the best that he had an actual tear, as opposed to having this chronic issue that he's sort of dealing with maybe throughout the rest of the regular season and right into the playoffs. If it was chronic, maybe they'd end up shelving him anyway and see if they could get a result before the playoffs. But of course, we're going to have to deal with the realities that Brogdon won't be playing for a little while. In terms of raw numbers that the Bucks are going to have to replace, at obviously shooting 50, 40, 90. Above those marks. He's at 15.6 points, 4.5 rebounds, and 3.2 assists. So Riley, I just want to throw it out there right away. How do you think the Bucks are going to try and tackle this absence from the team? How do you think they're going to try and replace him? Whether it's go big, put in one of these myriad wing players they have. What would be your approach?
I think it's interesting because we've seen Bud go both ways. So when Brogdon was out earlier this season, the guy who stepped up in the starting lineup was always Tony Snell. And I think that was like 3 or 4 games earlier in the season. And ever since acquiring Mirotic, he's been the go-to guy. So based off of recent evidence, I would guess that Bud's going to go big. And I'm not necessarily against that. I don't feel strongly one way or the other. I think maybe, I guess the question, not so much with the starting lineup for me, but more so how are you going to work it in with the substitutes? Because as of late, it seemed like there was a lot of minutes where Giannis and Chris might sub out, and then the only real starter who's left out there would be Malcolm kind of running the offense. And that was for just a couple minute stretches at the end of the first and kind of maybe even to the start of the second. But I think especially in the playoffs, as we saw last year, like the minutes where you don't have the starters out there was when the Bucks got killed. And part of that was because of the coaching and the fact that you were playing Shabazz Muhammad 35 minutes a night. But I think that's something that I would keep more of an eye on. Like if you go big, I mean, that's fine. Maybe you get Mirotic right off the bench and you kind of go for the rebounding or something along those lines. And he still offers up a lot of shooting, which is helpful. But I'm more curious, are they going to try and rely, as they did this afternoon against the Sixers, like having Chris out there kind of orchestrating the offense a little bit more? Maybe they try to stagger and have Eric out there more. So I'm curious how they're going to kind of patch up that hole. Maybe not so much for the starters, but more so for kind of within the rotation as a whole.
Yeah, that you talking about the Brogdon plus bench units, and I just pulled some of the numbers from NBA Wowie just in terms of raw minutes they've played. Brogdon far eclipses any of the other starters. So Brogdon, with none of the other starters on the court, have played 187 minutes this year. Tracks with the eye test. We've seen them finish up the end of quarters. Eric Bledsoe plus the bench, 28 minutes. Giannis plus the bench, 62 minutes. Chris Middleton plus the bench, 56 minutes. So really low totals for a lot of the rest of those guys. And I did exclude Brook Lopez, but I mean, you could throw him in there, and I wouldn't think that the numbers changed too drastically. But I do remember watching that Heat game and thinking it was so weird to see Bledsoe on the court without like Giannis and Chris, and having him like finish out that period, just because I'm so used to Malcolm Brogdon taking those minutes. So
yep.
that certainly is probably going to be the most interesting part to me. And George Hill coming back certainly helps that, because you hope that he can try and initiate a little bit of offense. But I think it's certainly going to be interesting to see how this changes Bud's staggering in terms of those three stars, who he wants to really try and finish out quarters, and if he switches up his substitution patterns at all.
Yeah, I think it's unique, or what's unique about Malcolm, like he's not the ideal point guard, but he has a lot of the skills and the IQ to be able to run the offense if you need to. And when you look at the roster, I mean, how many more guys do you have once Brogdon is out who can do that capably? It's pretty much Hill and Bledsoe, and Hill's just returned from an injury, and I don't know how quickly he's going to be able to ramp up his minutes. He seemed to kind of gotten a lot more burn as of late, but he's only played 2 games since getting back from a 9-game, being out for 9 games thanks to the adductor injury. So it's just a really tough spot. I'm confident that the Bucks will be able to overcome it. I mean, Giannis has had plenty of experience initiating the offense, and the offense itself is relatively simple. But as we were talking even just earlier in the episode, the fact that you're losing a guy who's so good at going to the rim time after time and converting there, or at least being a threat to convert there, and then that just adds another kind of headache for defenses to have to deal with. Do we kind of close in? Do we try and shut this guy down? Does that open up shooters on the perimeter? And those are no longer questions that other teams are going to have to answer nearly as often as they might have when Malcolm was out there. So it's definitely going to be a pain. And the Bucks seem to, at least this afternoon, and then against the Heat as well, handle it relatively well. Obviously the shots today, I was kind of unique and not really Brogdon related, even though he's a really good 3-point shooter, obviously. But I think it might be more of a pain for the playoffs, actually, just because of rotation shortening up. But I don't know. It puts a lot of things in flux, unfortunately.
Yeah, and you talked about the jumpers. Sometimes your just jump shots aren't going to fall, and the Bucks have certainly succeeded despite being sort of a high variance team with the high number of 3-point shots that they shoot. But there's also been plenty of spells where they shoot, maybe not an absurd number of 3-pointers, and they really just absolutely decimate other teams in the paint. And Malcolm Brogdon was a huge, huge part of that. 56% of his shots come at the rim this year. That's 95th percentile for combo guards. That figure was just 43% last year. And if you look at it on Cleaning the Glass, basically he just took all of the percentage of shots that he took from mid-range last year, shifted all of those over to shots at the rim. So taking low efficient shots and turning them into really highly efficient shots. And then his shooting at the rim, shooting 61% at the rim, He shot 62% there last year, but on nearly twice as many attempts this year as last year. So those are huge, huge figures for the Bucks and a team that has been dominant in the paint this whole season. And then the other thing that you were talking about, Chris Middleton, basically when he drives, it feels like he's get so easily shadowed and not able to get to the rim. And even when he gets there, he's not a super impressive finisher. We all know he kind of prefers to settle in the mid range. But Malcolm Brogdon is third on the Bucks in terms of drives per game, 10.1. He shoots basically half the time he decides to drive. He's at 53.3% field goal percentage on those drives. And I just pulled this on NBAstats.com. But if you look at all of the players in the league who drive 10 plus times per game, pretty high number. Only 45 players in the league do that. And he's ranks 9th in terms of that raw field goal percentage that he has. So I feel like that's really the part of his game that we absolutely do not give enough credence to. Is we all know he's been a surprisingly really, really good shooter. But I mean, his ability to both get to the rack despite a perceived lack of athleticism and still finish there is really been instrumental. And I think opened up a lot by this spacing that's been instituted by Bud's offense, and he's really benefited, I would say, maybe just as much as Giannis and Eric Bledsoe when he's driving to the hoop.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy that opening up the paint has just been like, okay, the guys who have benefited the most are like Giannis, who you could expect, but then the guards, like, I don't know, in years past, it was just like always clogged up. It is pretty impressive how quickly both of the guys have been able to kind of transition to take advantage of the fact, like, this is the scheme that we're running now. And another part of Brogdon is it's not only just driving and then finishing around the rim, but he's a pretty freaking good passer too. Like, he rarely turns the ball over as well. And I don't know if he was finding that many assists off of like driving kicks as well, but just the fact that you could have this guy who gives you a slightly different look because it isn't Giannis per se, and teams don't have to wall Giannis off, but he kind of does similar-ish things where he's a danger inside, but still also a danger to kind of find a guy on the outside as well. That's definitely underrated coming from a combo guard that's second round guy, and he's just kind of year over year improved and shown himself to be consistent when he gets opportunities. So I think it's definitely underrated, the fact that you have like mini Giannis in a way almost out for a couple of weeks here. Like, maybe that's going too far, but just like you were saying, I mean, he's unique in that for his size, he goes inside as often he does and converts as often he does. And even if he doesn't convert, the fact that opposing defenses have to kind of account for the fact that, okay, he might come in, that you're not relying on just Giannis to kind of collapse the defense and force the stretching. You're able to use 3 guys to do it. And now that you're down to 2, how does that shift things? Especially, like, I don't know, if you put Tony in there, that doesn't really replicate it. I mean, he can kind of drive a little bit, but Tony doesn't do a lot, as we all know. And Nikola, obviously, he's almost exclusively at this point in this scheme a 3-point shooter. So that also is not really a viable option. So now that you only have 2 guys, is that going to mean there's not nearly as many threes, or is it going to be harder to get inside? So I think that's something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think it just gives them, it just clearly limits their options. I mean, when their threes aren't falling, it's just harder for them to be able to be like, all right, well, let's just drive in and try and get some easy points at the bucket so we can sustain ourselves until our threes start falling. I mean, they could have really, that's basically what Giannis did today in the third quarter. I mean, when he scored 17, he was like, all right, well, you guys aren't hitting shots, so I'm just going to go right to the basket and bowl over Boban and Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid and keep us in this game until some of these shots might be able to fall. Of course, that didn't happen today, where they were able to come back. But, I mean, you look at Malcolm Brogdon, there's a little bit of credence to the fact that he gets blinders when he drives, for sure. He doesn't have a huge assist percentage when he drives, even though he drives, like 2 times less than Giannis. He has takes more field goal attempts than Giannis. Chris Middleton is, I think, a more adept passer, and so he passes a little bit more on those drives. But like we said, he just has a little more, I think he has a little more trouble getting to the hoop. And it basically, after those 4, it drops off a cliff. And maybe in more minutes, George Hill could have a potential to do that, but he's only had 2.6 drives per game this season. I have no idea what his career high might be in that figure. But I mean, after that, it's like Sterling Brown 2.2, Pat Connaughton 2.1, Brook Lopez at 2, who might be a better driver than Chris Middleton, actually, when he gets going down there.
He's moving at 2 miles an hour the entire way, like left foot, right foot, and dunk on you. It's not really the most athletic thing out there, but he gets it done, I guess.
Yeah, certainly. So I just think that's one thing that they're absolutely going to miss is a guy who you say can collapse the defense and try and distribute out, and hopefully they're able to pick up a little bit of the slack there. And then the other thing that I was thinking about is even just looking at, I mean, he's made some huge threes down the stretch this season, and the numbers certainly back it up. So that 85 clutch minutes, which if you don't know, is the game is within 5 points within the last 5 minutes of the game. And the 85 minutes that he has so far in the clutch is fourth most on the team. And he's an absurd 9 for 12 on 3-pointers in the clutch this season, which is
ice in his veins, ice in the veins.
An absolutely ridiculous number, especially when you look at how the Bucks' other guys are shooting from deep. Giannis is 1 for 5. Chris Middleton 8 for 22, 36.4%. Eric Bledsoe, surprisingly, 7 for 15. That's a number that actually might come down. So look for that potentially in the playoffs. Brook Lopez, 1 for 9. Really poor.
He made that 3 today. He that like all the way out from Rhinelander. That was hopefully that helped boost that number for him.
And then after that, I mean, you're just getting into such small minutes, but surprise. Who would you guess has played the most clutch minutes for the Bucks outside of the 5 starters?
Man, that's tough. It might even be like Mirotic even. Is he even close? Probably not.
No, he's not that close. It's Pat Connaughton.
Actually, yeah. I mean, he's gotten a lot of run as of late, and that would make sense.
And I feel like there was a spell where he was even like playing minutes maybe over Bledsoe. Like, wasn't he like getting some minutes over Bledsoe potentially in the? I might be remembering that.
Yeah, I think was that like early in the season where like, well, that shows that Bud really trusts Connaughton on defense or what. I think was our early season takeaway on that.
Yeah. Just to lend some numbers to that, he's minus 27 in those 41 minutes. 1 for 9 from the field, 0 for 7 from deep. The guy after that is Ersan at 29 minutes. He's a solid 3 for 8. I mean, Ersan just is basically Ersan at this point. It's good to see him making shots again. Defensively, it's a little scary. Then Tony Snell after that, Sterling Brown. So, I mean, you're worried about those top 5 guys. And I think missing a guy like Brogdon, I mean, you just think about if we're putting Pat Connaughton in that spot because they're just looking for a guard. I mean, just look what he's done so far and already given his iffy 3-point shooting just as a career shooter anyway. So I think there's a lot of repercussions to this, and we can say, well, maybe they can sort of do work by committee and sort of akin to some of the argument that some people have regarding, if let's say Chris Middleton walked, like, well, they have this sort of this depth that can all replace him. They can get a little bit of defense from Sterling Brown, a little bit of shot making from him, and then maybe
like they Frankenstein everybody like in the offseason, like, okay, we're gonna take Sterling's right arm, give me DJ's left leg, like form into a mega person.
And the best part about that is that they have that person all in one. It's just Malcolm Brogdon. Like they have a guy who can just offers you a lot of different looks on offense, and I would say probably epitomizes. Okay, maybe not the passing part always, but I think he epitomizes a lot of the shoot, dribble, pass stuff that Bud espoused when he's looking for in a player, and clearly you look at the kind of guys that he's really have sort of become his pet players. I think he certainly epitomizes that.
Yeah, and I think what's most difficult with this injury and just kind of evaluating Malcolm, like, yes, he's obviously unique in that he's so skilled in so many different aspects of the game. But with this injury, and he had that quad injury last year, right? And I think there were concerns before he was even drafted about a supposed like foot problems or something along those lines, which I don't know if this is related to that. But I think it's just another point in the constellation of many of like, how are the Bucks going to address his free agency? And I think maybe these coming weeks will be a good referendum on how important he is really. And, you should never obviously confirm or deny whether or not a guy should stay on the team just because of 2 weeks of play. But I think we'll get a good idea. Like, okay, so is the team able to function? Maybe not. And what does that kind of do for his value? Can rely on this guy? Like, I think there's a lot of interesting questions of such a talented guy, but is he someone you can quote unquote rely on? I mean, he's been healthy throughout this year. He was healthy all the way through last year, and he's had just kind of 2 freakish injuries that unfortunately derailed the season right near the end.
Yeah, and his free agency is obviously a huge impending thing looming over all this. And you're totally right to point out this could be an interesting test drive. We talked a lot about how much will the Bucks read from the regular season versus the playoffs when deciding what kind of number to give these kind of guys. Obviously, they saw enough in the regular season to just go ahead with Bledsoe, and they both agreed that the deal might be mutually beneficial for both. But Brogdon, of course, they have this 50, 40, 90 season in the regular season that's going to remain intact regardless, because he's not going to come back for the playoffs. And
yeah, are we sure he didn't purposely tear his? It was like, all right, bro, just go at it with this samurai sword. We're gonna tear it right here, right now.
That was a deft move by his agent. And then you also so you also mentioned his injury back in college. It was to repair a broken bone in his left foot. This one is in his right foot, so that's good. The other thing that I was thinking about is that, I mean, he's not a guy who relies a lot on athleticism, and I'm absolutely not a doctor. But he is a guy who seems like he plants a lot on his right foot and does all these sort of weird finishes around the basket. I mean, he doesn't draw many fouls, but he has all of this weird repertoire of moves to be able to finish over guys. So I'm curious if that's going to be something that's going to plague him when he comes back, and nervousness regarding himself planting off that foot as he drives to the basket.
Yeah, I mean, like you were, or as we were kind of talking about with this injury, I'm not sure if that's really going to be the case, because it's more of like a just not like a stress fracture per se, but it's just something that kind of builds up over time. It's not like a ACL or MCL tear where it's this catastrophic, like, can I trust my knee be able to hold up? I'm guessing he was probably dealing with this over the preceding couple of weeks, and they just kind of rode with it, because you can get by if you need to. Like, it's going to suck and it's going to hurt a lot, but I'm not sure if it's so much like, oh, can I trust my foot to be able to allow me to do this? If it heals properly, I'm not sure if that's the case, but I think there's still a question whether or not you could declare him not injury prone per se, but I think we've seen over the years that you kind of have to account for the fact that Malcolm might sustain some sort of injury, at least for a couple of games, and hopefully the timing isn't as bad as it is right now. But that's something to definitely account for when you're thinking about what kind of value or what kind of contract he might be coming his way.
All right, Riley. I want to talk about. Maybe we'll talk about the defense, but we may have to get a larger sample size to kind of see how the Bucks might tackle that. But I want to have a quick intervention on behalf of Tony Snell. He seems like he should be the guy that would be able to step up in Brogdon's absence. He was that guy last year. He started all the time. And I was one of the people who was saying it just seems to make a lot more sense to have Tony Snell in the starting lineup than Malcolm Brogdon. I was wrong. I was just flat out wrong. And then when you look at how Tony's season is gone, it's kind of fascinating. I mean, he's at the lowest minutes he's played per game since his rookie season. Today in Philadelphia, I mean, he plays 8 minutes, gets one shot attempt up, and then is zeros across the rest of the stat line. Doesn't. It's
a very Tony Snell game, is what that was.
Yeah, completely. And I mean, he doesn't offer the driving ability of Brogdon. He's flashed a few things, but he just doesn't have the ball skills to do that kind of stuff. He could just be a straight up volume 3-point shooter. And I think is a more reliable option than Pat Connaughton, but clearly Bud seems to value Connaughton and maybe a little bit of his foot speed on defense over Tony Snell. Even though Tony Snell guarded Russell Westbrook 2 years ago, so I don't know, that maybe I might be missing something there, but he seems like the kind of guy who could sort of step into that role. What do you think has happened to the slightly wayward season of my guy Tony Snell?
Would you say it's wayward? I think he's having an awesome season for him. I mean, we're not even talking about him, which I think is probably what he prefers, right? If I was getting in the mind of Tony.
I guess if I was Tony Snell and I saw Pat Connaughton getting more minutes than me, I would think I can be Pat Connaughton. That's how I would think. Wayward is a mischaracterization. He's having a good season. He's shooting well. He's at 39.9% from three. He's sort of doing his Tony Snell things. He's averaging more 3-point attempts per 36. I mean, he's having a good season. I guess if I were him right now, though, I'd kind of feel like, all right, well, this is like when I'm supposed to step up. I mean, this is like when I can take minutes from Pat Connaughton and usurp that sort of role that I had last year.
Tony's probably sitting on the bench going, LOL, I'm making 10 times more money than that guy. No, I agree that, obviously all these guys are competitors, so I was just joking about that. But I would agree that if you're in Tony's mind, this is probably the time that you step up, or you would think you would get the opportunity to. And is probably doubly so because, like I said earlier, when Brogdon was out earlier this season, he was the go-to guy to come off the bench to kind of slot in the starting unit. Now, we saw that a lot under Kidd. And I'm not sure if that was just like a pet project or if Kidd kind of had a similar approach to what we were thinking, like, oh, you have this kind of lower usage guy who's a really good 3-point shooter and kind of does a little bit of everything. I'm curious how much of it is, and Kyle and I kind of started talking about this a little bit last week, and I never know how much to put stock into this, but how much of it is like Connaughton was a quote unquote Bud guy or somebody that Bud targeted or feels more comfortable with, whereas Tony is a leftover from the previous regime. And fair or otherwise, maybe that has something to do with it. And even when Tony was getting starts last year, I mean, here, I have to pull up his minutes, but was he even getting like massively more minutes per game than he is this year?
Well, if you look,
oh yeah, he had like 10 more minutes.
Game. Yeah, he was at like 27.4. I mean, you look at the per 36 numbers; they're better this year. I mean, he's taking more shots, so he's being a little less of that. Quiet Tony Snell on the court. But I don't know. I mean, he's having a good year. I'm a Tony Snell stan. Clearly I'm kind of trying to make some sort of weird case for him here, even especially with Sterling Brown out as well. I was just looking at some of like the efficiency numbers on off for the Bucks this year. If you look at some of the guys that you would have replace Malcolm Brogdon, so this is basically the efficiency differential per cleaning the glass. So it takes out garbage time and all that kind of stuff. So basically, all of the starters are up there in the positive. So Chris Middleton's at plus 3.8, Bledsoe plus 5.4, Brook Lopez plus 6.7, Giannis plus 7. Nikola Mirotic, kind of surprised that he was at the top at plus 9.4, but of course a significantly smaller sample size there. Brogdon's the worst among the starters. So in 1,800 minutes, he's at a minus 0.8, which you might sort of chalk up to him maybe some of those minutes with the bench units, but that's not a whole lot of minutes out of his full total there. And then you go a little bit lower than that. Pat Connaughton minus 1.4, Foundmaker RIP minus 2.3, George Hill minus 3.6, Tony Snell minus 6, Sterling Brown minus 13.7. Who I was really surprised by how low Sterling Brown is because I thought he seemed like he was playing well this year and seemed like he fitted in everything, but a lot of the efficiency numbers just don't really benefit him.
We don't bring up those numbers on this podcast.
Oh, okay.
We're going to keep that. Like, you're Tony Snell. We're going to keep that secret for Sterling Brown for me.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Hold on. I'm going back to.
I read this wrong. It's Sterling plus 13. My bad.
Oh, yeah. So I don't know. I mean, there's not an easy that's why I think Brogdon is so interesting, is that there's just not an easy answer for him. I think there's not an easy answer for any of these starters who might get hurt, but there's sometimes guys who you could kind of see fitting in and playing in that spot. But Brogdon's at such a deep position for the Bucks. It's hard to really peg out one guy who's going to like suddenly get the boost, especially given how Bud's just sort of utilized that spot this year and swapped between Pat Connaughton and George Hill, and Tony Snell's been the most consistent in terms of getting minutes, but like Sterling Brown or Dante DiVincenzo, it's kind of been by the gust of the wind, depending on how Bud feels.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, how would you feel? You kind of asked me earlier when we started talking about this. Would you rather? So you would obviously rather them go with Tony in the starting lineup. I have to imagine they would probably stick along those lines, because unless it's like a matchup dependent thing where like the other team, like the Sixers, for example, are obviously a large starting lineup. So maybe Mirotic getting the start was to counteract that. But I'm curious to see, do you continue to plug in wings for Brogdon? Like for me personally, I don't see the plus side to having more length out there, especially in the starting lineup. But I don't know. Do you feel like can you explain to me why like having Mirotic out there would be a positive in the starting lineup?
Well, I think Mirotic is really interesting because I think obviously Brogdon spaces the floor, but I also think that like defensively it might lead them to wanting to switch like a bit more, given they'd like really would only have like one guard who could kind of really execute the chase down around picks type of defense. I mean, it's really just like Bledsoe and Giannis can try and fight around it, and Chris Middleton can try and fight around those picks, but I just don't think they're quite as adept at it as Brogdon would be, given his slightly smaller frame. So I wonder if Mirotic might lead them to switch a little more, which would be kind of intriguing to me. But Bud's been so he's really wanted to run that zone defense scheme, and he's gone away from it, just that zone drop scheme. He's gone away from it and been a little more lenient on letting them switch. But I'm a little more. I would lean a little bit more towards Mirotic, maybe just because I feel like that gives you a bit more matchup problems. I mean, I think he can, even if he can't stick with a guard on the defensive end, I think even if it's just like integrating him into the Bucks offense more, or like letting him shoot his way out of any sort of potential slump he's in, like I think he is the guy who, if Brogdon is out, has by far the most potential to replace his production and help them win a playoff series potentially. I mean, I think with Brogdon out, you basically need everyone else to step up. And I think Mirotic is the guy who, just from a raw numbers point, has by far the easiest path from where he's at now to where he could get in terms of replacing Brogdon's numbers. So I guess from a very sort of slightly, I would say, not super advanced or like advanced stats oriented thing, I think that could be one of the benefits of having Mirotic over some of these other guys.
Yeah, kind of just thinking about it, now that you speak about that, kind of conceptually thinking about it, like if you're not going to be able to have a guy like Brogdon out there who's able to generate the kind of spacing just by, or taking advantage of the spacing, if you have to artificially generate the spacing, then Mirotic might be the best out there, just because, as we were talking about, none of the other wing guys who could fill in for Brogdon are nearly as adept and would be able to replicate it to a high enough degree to make the offense still work. So I guess that would make sense if you have to force opponents to respect the perimeter, so you just throw another guy out there, and then even though you're not able to take as much advantage inside, you're not clogging it up per se. So I guess that makes sense.
Yeah. All right. Well, any other closing thoughts on this Brogdon discussion? I think it's really going to be fascinating to see how this goes throughout the rest of the season. And at least for this week, we're going to put Dante's Inferno on ice for 1 week while he gets back from that bursitis issue that apparently flamed up again. Please get well soon, Dante, so we can thrust you into this discussion a little further. But anything else you want to say about this Brogdon injury issue?
No, I would just say, or conclude by saying, it sucks. And it illuminates just how lucky the Bucks have been with injury problems this year. I mean, yeah, Dante's had a long stretch, and Hill and Sterling, but for the most part, the top 5 guys have had a really clean bill of health throughout the season. So really, really unfortunate that it happens this late into the season, but hopefully that's about it in terms. Hopefully the basketball gods have taken their sacrifice from the Bucks for the year, and we can get through the rest of the season with a clean bill of health.
Yeah, fingers crossed. And if you're looking for how I'm feeling this week about that bet, Kyle was pretty far out when I saw that Brogdon injury, so that wasn't wasn't great for how I felt about making my money back. All right, well let's move on to the final topic here and just take a peek at the week ahead. So on Tuesday, the Bucks will match up at home against the Los Angeles Lakers. LeBron James comes to town. They are fresh off getting beat by, God dang it, who do they just lose to? I'm so sorry.
Lost to the Knicks, right?
Yeah, they just lost to the Knicks. All right, that was hilarious. All right, so the Lakers just lost to the Knicks. That was really funny. And then they go on Wednesday night to Cleveland. And then they come back to the Fiserv to take on the Heat on Friday, and then finish it off with a Sunday game against the Cleveland Cavaliers. So, Riley, how do you think the Bucks are going to fare in this 4-game stretch?
I think this might be one of the rare weeks, and maybe you're going to ruin it. No pressure on you, but I think we might all go 4-0 this week, just because none of these teams are great. Like, I think the Lakers are already eliminated from playoff contention, so I don't even know if LeBron is suiting up anymore. It could be, did he play against the Knicks? Do we know? It really doesn't matter one way or the other. I mean, he did play. Okay. Well, even if he did play, I mean, playoff mode, LeBron is no longer relevant because they're not going to make the playoffs, which is shocking and hilarious in its own way. Cleveland is awful, as everybody knows. And the Heat, we just gave them the business, and I assume it will go the same way at home. So I am pretty confident we're going to come through this week 4-0. The only issue would be the at Cleveland game, especially if Bud uses that as another opportunity to rest Giannis. But otherwise, I see probably a 4-0 week coming.
Yeah, that's of course a Sega Baba there, second game of back-to-back. Kyle guessed that they would go 4-0. Thankfully, he got his guess in time so that we can't make up words and put them in his mouth. It was a smart move, Kyle, savvy. Yeah, because I saw how that went.
He's a giant. Which Wisconsin big man was it? You gave me a shot, John Lure fan.
Yeah,
he's figure out what the equivalent would be for Kyle.
Huge John Lure fan. Maybe deep cut. Mike Wilkinson. That would be he could be a big Mike Wilkinson fan from back in the day. Keaton Yankaville, that would be a deep cut as well. Madison Memorial guy. Once served a pretzel to him at Auntie Anne's, actually.
Oh, would it be? Okay, hold on. We buried the lead. We buried it deep. We need more on the story next week.
Yeah, tune in next week. So I'm going to go 4-0 as well. I just think the Bucks are going to take care of business, and they hopefully maintain their lead on the Raptors. Thank you to the Raptors, by the way, for giving us another gift and just blowing their game today on Sunday against the Detroit Pistons. Thank you, Andre Drummond. Thank you, Blake Griffin, for beating the Raptors to maintain the Bucks. Was there 3-game lead still? Yeah, 3-game lead in the Eastern Conference. So that's just seemed to work out. Where if the Bucks are losing on a night, the Raptors seem to lose that same night. So thank you,
Thon Maker, clutch 7 points, 3 rebounds, 0 from 3. He knew deep down. He's like, this is from these are from my guys.
Okay. All right. Well, let's just read his box score really quick. All right, 17 minutes for Thon. Thank you. 7 points, 3 boards, 2 blocks, 2 for 5 from the field, 3 for 3 from the free throw line, 0 for 3 from deep.
Can you imagine how hyped he was on those blocks too? Oh my God. I just got chills thinking about him screaming into the sky.
Finished a +3.
I don't mean to clown on you, Thon. It's all good.
Look, we all love Thon. And then in that, did LeBron play in that game? No, that's right, because I saw that hilarious tweet on Friday night that said if LeBron was playing in the Lakers game, Thon would have absolutely destroyed him, which is really funny to me.
Hashtag facts only.
With no LeBron, Thon had 4 points, 3 boards, and a lot of 3 personal fouls. All right, there we go. -7. Thon Maker, you'll always be in our hearts.
That's it for our look around the league this week.
You'll always be a Buck in our hearts. All right, well, let's close it on that, Riley, just with a Thon Maker box score breakdown, and we'll head out for the week. Thanks as always for listening. It feels good to be back. We might have the whole crew back together next Sunday. We haven't really talked about it at all. But in the meantime, go on to your favorite podcast app. We're available there. Check us out on iTunes, Stitcher. Rate, review us, 5 stars, por favor, or whatever you think we're worth. And make sure to check out Brian's weekly Bucks Film Room podcast. Always really, really great. He had an excellent breakdown last week with Jackson Frank, who was really hard for me to not switch that around when I was just talking about Frank Jackson on the Pelicans, but he was from Liberty Ballers, broke down the 76ers. Awesome stuff. Drops every single Thursday morning. And then also go online, Mitchell Maurer, co-managing editor of Pooooood.com, wrote an excellent piece breaking down who could possibly replace Brogdon from the bevy of wings, and then also potentially Nikola Mirotic. So make sure to go to Pooooood.com, listen to us every week that you can. Let us know any feedback you have. Thanks again.